Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about a place many romanticize, a golden age of empires and innovation, ancient Rome. Forget the marble statues and epic legends for a moment, because what we're really diving into is the brutal, unforgiving grind that defined everyday existence for the vast majority. It wasn't about glorious triumphs. It was about survival, stench, and the constant threat of oblivion. If you think your life is tough, well, you're about to get a serious dose of perspective. Before we plunge into the gritty reality, do me a favor, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Alright, find that cozy spot, pull your blanket up tight, and let the flickering shadows carry you back, far beyond the reach of your modern comforts, into a world where misery was often the only constant companion. Now close your eyes, or keep them open if the thought of the past is too much to bear in true darkness, and let your imagination pull you, not gently, but with a visceral tug, into the teeming heart of Rome. Sometime around the 1st century CE, you're standing, or perhaps more accurately, trying to keep your footing in a narrow cobbled street. But this isn't some quaint, romanticized lane from a travel brochure. This is the real deal, and the first assault on your modern sensibilities isn't visual. It's an immediate, pervasive, almost suffocating olfactory punch to the gut. The smell, dear listener, is everything. It's a complex, overwhelming tapestry woven from the most repulsive threads imaginable, and it clings to the very air, to your clothes, to your hair, a constant, inescapable companion that would send you reeling in your pristine, sanitized modern existence. Think for a moment about the subtle background hum of your own home, the faint scent of laundry detergent, perhaps a lingering whiff of your last meal, or the fresh air filtered through your HVAC system. Now obliterate that, erase it entirely. Replace it with the raw, aggressive reek of human waste. Public latrines, if you were lucky enough to be near one, were often open-air affairs, or at best, communal benches over a running channel of water, but even those were less a solution and more a public display of the problem. Many, particularly the poor, in their cramped insulae, those towering, rickety apartment blocks we'll talk about later, had no access to any form of indoor plumbing, not even the rudimentary kind. So, what did you do? You used a chamber pot. And when that chamber pot was full, what happened next? Well, you didn't have sophisticated waste disposal systems. You often simply emptied it out of your window directly onto the street below. Imagine that for a second. The sudden splash, the guttural curses from a passerby who wasn't quick enough, the sheer brazenness of it. It wasn't just occasional. It was a daily ritual, a contribution to the putrid rivers that flowed. Not in underground sewers, but right there on the surface of your civilized Roman street. So, as you stand there, absorbing this invisible miasma, the smell of excrement is just the beginning. Layered upon it is the cloying sweetness of rotting refuse, discarded food scraps, vegetable peelings, animal entrails from the butcher shops that didn't have the luxury of refrigeration. You can almost feel the humidity in the air, amplifying these odors, making them heavier, more potent. Then comes the sharp, metallic tang of unwashed bodies, the sweat and grime of thousands of people packed into a relatively small urban space, bodies that perhaps hadn't seen proper cleansing in days, if not weeks. Soap as you know it, with its sweet fragrances and lathering properties, didn't exist. They used oils and strigils, scraping dirt off their skin, a process that, while effective, didn't leave you smelling like a spring meadow. Add to this symphony of stink the pervasive aroma of animals. Horses, mules, donkeys, drawing carts, leaving their droppings right there on the cobbles. Stray dogs and cats, scavengers, adding their own contributions to the olfactory landscape. And underneath it all, a baseline of damp earth, mildew, and the unidentifiable funk of ancient, stagnant water that gathered in puddles and crevices, breeding grounds for unseen horrors. This wasn't just an unpleasant experience. It was a constant, low-level assault on your senses, a persistent reminder of the lack of sanitation that defined daily life. Your modern nose, accustomed to sterile environments and air fresheners, would be in constant protest, a battle it would quickly lose. You'd find yourself trying to breathe shallowly, perhaps tying a piece of cloth over your face. A futile gesture against such an all-encompassing reek. Now, let's talk about the visual aspect that accompanies this olfactory nightmare. Look down at your feet. The streets are not clean. They are often a slurry of mud, animal droppings, human waste, and discarded rubbish. You try to avoid stepping in the deeper puddles, but it's an impossible task. Your sandals, if you even have decent ones, are quickly caked in this vile mixture. You can feel the squish beneath your soles, the dampness seeping through, a chilling reminder of what you're walking through. The very ground you tread upon is a breeding ground for disease. There are no city cleaners diligently sweeping up every morning, no automated street sweepers. Whatever the rain doesn't wash away into the Tiber or into whatever inadequate drains exist, simply stays there festering, baking in the sun, or chilling in the rain, constantly contributing to the overall putridity. And this leads us inevitably to the rampant, terrifying spectre of disease. In your world, a simple cut is an inconvenience, treatable with antiseptic and a band-aid. In ancient Rome, that same cut, exposed to the filth of the streets, to the bacteria thriving in every speck of dust and droplet of water, could be a death sentence. Infection was common, often swift and brutal. You lived with a constant, unspoken dread of the invisible killers that surrounded you. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera. These weren't abstract historical footnotes. They were immediate, agonizing realities that could strike anyone down, often with little warning and even less hope of recovery. Imagine the constant stomach cramps, the fever, the debilitating weakness, knowing that the very water you drink, the food you eat, the air you breathe, could be carrying your doom. The grand aqueducts, often celebrated as engineering marvels, did bring fresh water into the city. But where did that water go after it had served its purpose in the public baths and fountains? Much of it flowed through the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer, which was indeed a marvel for its time. However, this system wasn't comprehensive. It didn't service every single home, especially not the multi-story tenements of the poor. And even where it did exist, the concept of hygiene was fundamentally different. Water wasn't purified in the modern sense. It carried whatever contaminants it picked up along its journey. You might collect water from a public fountain, hoping it was clean, but then you'd carry it back to your squalid apartment, where other contaminants could easily enter. Childhood mortality rates were astronomical. Imagine the anguish of a parent watching their child succumb to a fever, a cough, a sudden sickness that in your time would be a minor ailment, easily treated. But here, there was no pediatrician, no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory. The child's fever would burn, their breathing would become labored, their little body racked with pain, and you as a parent would be utterly helpless, praying to gods who seemed deaf to your pleas, watching life flicker out with agonizing slowness. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a common, brutal experience that shaped the emotional landscape of Roman families, a constant shadow hanging over every birth, every childhood, every family gathering. You wouldn't form the same deep, perhaps naive, attachments to children that modern parents do, knowing in the back of your mind that their odds of reaching adulthood were disturbingly low. Even the public baths, those magnificent edifices of Roman social life, while providing a degree of cleansing, were not the bastions of modern hygiene you might imagine. They were crowded, often filled with hundreds, if not thousands of people. The water, while flowing, wasn't sterile. Diseases could easily spread in such close quarters. You might go to the baths to feel clean, to socialize, to exercise, but you also ran the risk of picking up skin infections, respiratory ailments, or worse. The concept of personal hygiene, in the sense of preventing the spread of disease through meticulous hand-washing or sanitation, was unknown. People shared the same bathing water, sweated in the same hot rooms, and scraped themselves with the same communal strigils, instruments for scraping oil and dirt off the skin, without a thought for cross-contamination. Consider the simple act of eating. In your world, you buy pre-packaged food from a supermarket, confident in its safety. In Rome, you bought your food from street vendors, from markets teeming with flies. Meat might have been exposed to the elements for hours, if not days, without refrigeration. Vegetables could have been grown in fields fertilized with human manure, then washed, if at all, in contaminated water. The very act of nourishing yourself was a gamble, a roll of the dice with your health. Food poisoning was an everyday threat, not a rare incident. Imagine the chronic, low-level digestive discomfort you would live with, the frequent bouts of diarrhea, the pervasive feeling of your gut being off-kilter. This wasn't some exotic adventure. This was your baseline, your normal. The air itself, in addition to its foul odors, was often thick with soot and smoke. Cooking fires, blacksmiths' forges, public kilns, all contributed to a constant haze that hung over the city, especially in winter. You would breathe this in day after day, year after year, slowly but surely damaging your lungs. Respiratory ailments, chronic coughs, wheezing, these would be common complaints, not just for the elderly, but for people of all ages. The concept of clean air, of an environment free from particulate matter, was utterly alien. You'd wake up with a dryness in your throat, a persistent tickle, knowing that your lungs were constantly working overtime to filter out the grime of the city. Even the most basic human dignity, the right to privacy and cleanliness in your own bodily functions, was often denied. If you were poor, you lived in a building with dozens, if not hundreds of others. There was no private toilet, no private washing facility. Everything was communal, shared, exposed. The shame, the discomfort, the sheer lack of personal space and control over such intimate acts would be deeply unsettling for your modern sensibilities. You would quickly lose any sense of personal boundaries you once held, becoming hardened to the constant presence of others, the constant awareness of their bodily functions, their struggles, their very existence pressed up against your own. So, as you step back from this mental exercise back into the quiet comfort of your own space, take a moment to truly appreciate the invisible blessings of modern sanitation. The clean water that flows effortlessly from your tap, the flush toilet that whisks away waste without a second thought, the sterile environments of hospitals, the ubiquitous presence of soap and hand sanitizer, the refrigerated food that protects you from pathogens. These aren't just conveniences. They are fundamental pillars of your health and well-being, gifts that were utterly, brutally absent for the vast majority of people living in even the most advanced civilization of its time. Ancient Rome. Their world was a world where disease was a constant threat, where stench was a way of life, and where the very air you breathed could be a silent killer. And this, my friend, is just the beginning of the Roman misery. Shift your focus now from the assault on your senses to the gnawing, persistent ache in your stomach. For the vast majority of people in ancient Rome, particularly those not born into the elite senatorial or equestrian orders, life was a relentless, precarious struggle against hunger. Forget the images of lavish banquets and endless feasts you've seen in movies. Those were the exclusive domain of the 1%. Truly. For you, the common Roman, hunger wasn't a temporary inconvenience remedied by a quick trip to the fridge. It was a constant, debilitating companion, a low-level anxiety that permeated every decision, every moment of your waking life, and often haunted your fitful sleep. Imagine waking up, not to the aroma of coffee or a freshly prepared breakfast, but to the hollow feeling in your gut that's been there since yesterday afternoon. Your body feels weak, your mind a little foggy, a persistent dull ache behind your eyes. Your first thought isn't about your schedule or your goals for the day. It's about where the next meal, even a meager one, will come from. This isn't just about feeling peckish. This is about the profound physiological impact of chronic caloric deficit. Your muscles ache, your joints feel stiff, and the simple act of standing for long periods becomes an effort. You're constantly conserving energy, moving slower, thinking less sharply. Your body's metabolic furnace sputtering on fumes. The Roman economy, for all its sophistication in some areas, was fundamentally agrarian and prone to boom and bust cycles. Harvest failures, droughts, floods, plagues of locusts. These weren't just bad news for farmers. They were catastrophes for the entire population. You lived in a world without sophisticated global supply chains, without food aid organizations, without rapid transportation of foodstuffs from distant, unaffected regions. If the local harvest failed, or if the grain ships from Egypt or North Africa were delayed or shipwrecked, the price of bread, the absolute staple of the Roman diet, would skyrocket. And when that happened, panic would set in. You, as a common urban dweller, might rely on the annona, the state-subsidized grain distribution. It sounds benevolent, doesn't it? A generous government providing for its people. But the reality was far grittier. First, not everyone qualified for the dole. You had to be a male Roman citizen living in Rome and often meet specific property requirements. If you were a woman, a child, a slave, a foreigner, or lived outside the capital, you were largely out of luck. Even for those who did qualify, the dole wasn't always enough. It was typically a fixed amount of grain per month, usually wheat, which you then had to take to a mill, pay to have ground into flour, and then bake into bread yourself, or pay a baker. This entire process added costs and effort, turning a seemingly simple provision into a logistical challenge. And then there was the unpredictability. Political instability, administrative corruption, simple logistical failures, any of these could disrupt the dole. Imagine lining up for hours, perhaps even overnight, for your allocation of grain, only to be told that the ships haven't arrived, or that the storehouses are empty, or that the official in charge has decided to enrich himself by diverting supplies. The simmering resentment, the desperate glances at your hungry children, the gnawing realization that your only safety net has just vanished beneath your feet. This was the reality. You'd watch your neighbors, equally desperate, grow agitated, arguments erupting, fear turning into anger. When the dole failed or wasn't enough, you had to turn to the market. And that's where the brutal reality of price volatility hit hardest. You might earn a few sestertii a day as a casual laborer, a porter, hawker, or a craftsman. But if a loaf of bread suddenly cost half your daily wage or even more, what did that leave you for everything else? For rent in your cramped apartment? For lamp oil? For basic clothing? The answer was often nothing. You would make impossible choices. Do you eat today, or do you pay a portion of your rent, knowing eviction looms? Do you buy a small piece of salted fish for protein, or do you stretch your bread out for an extra day? Every decision was a calculation of survival, a trade-off between immediate hunger and future destitution. Your diet would be monotonous, incredibly limited. You wouldn't be thinking about 5 a day or balanced nutrition. You'd be thinking about calories, pure and simple. Bread, usually a coarse, dark wholemeal loaf, was the absolute foundation, and perhaps some cheap gruel made from barley or millet. A few lentils or beans if you could afford them. Olives, cheese if you were lucky, and perhaps some seasonal vegetables or fruits bought from a street vendor. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for festivals or special occasions, and even then often the less desirable cuts or offal. Fish, particularly salted varieties, might provide some protein, but again, it wasn't cheap. You'd dream of a full stomach, a meal where you didn't have to consciously savor every crumb, every morsel, knowing it might be hours or even a full day before you ate again. The consequences of this chronic malnutrition were pervasive and devastating. Your body would be constantly fighting against itself. Your immune system would be weakened, making you more susceptible to the myriad diseases we discussed in the previous segment. You'd be more prone to infections, to long recovery times from even minor illnesses. Your physical strength would be diminished, making manual labor, which was the lifeline for many, harder to perform, thus perpetuating the cycle of poverty. For children, the impact was even more severe. Stunted growth, cognitive impairment, lifelong health problems. These were the silent scars of a childhood lived on the precipice of starvation. You'd see the gaunt faces, the hollow eyes, the distended bellies of children around you, and a cold dread would settle in your heart, a constant fear that your own offspring might share the same fate. Then there's the psychological toll, the constant anxiety, the pervasive stress of never knowing where your next meal will come from. This isn't just about feeling hungry, it's about the deep, existential insecurity that gnaws at your soul. You can't plan for the future when your present is so precarious. You can't invest in education for your children or save for old age when every penny you earn is immediately consumed by the desperate need for sustenance. Hope itself becomes a luxury you can barely afford. Your world shrinks to the immediate, the pressing, the desperate search for calories. You become hyper-focused on food, on its acquisition, on its preservation, on its distribution within your family. Every scrap is valuable, nothing is wasted. Consider the energy required for simply moving through your day when you're constantly underfed. The laborious walk to the forum, the heavy lifting at the docks, the endless hours of repetitive tasks in a workshop. All of it is amplified by the weakness in your limbs, the lightheadedness that threatens to overcome you if you stand up too quickly. You wouldn't have the mental clarity, the sustained focus, the sheer physical stamina that you take for granted in your well-nourished existence. Your productivity would be lower, further entrenching you in poverty. You'd see the robust, well-fed bodies of the elite, their skin glowing, their movements confident, and the contrast would be stark, a constant, irritating reminder of your own physical decline. And what about the sheer indignity of it? To beg for scraps, to scavenge in the streets, to watch others feast while your stomach growled. You would develop a hardened exterior, a cynicism born of repeated disappointment and constant struggle. The generosity of a stranger, if it came, would be met with suspicion as much as gratitude, because such acts were rare and often came with strings attached. You would learn to distrust, to guard your meager possessions fiercely, to compete ruthlessly with others who were just as desperate as you. The bonds of community, while strong in some ways, were also frayed by the constant pressure of scarcity, turning neighbor against neighbor in the fight for survival. Even when you did eat, the meals were often prepared in unsanitary conditions. Cooking over an open fire in a cramped apartment without proper ventilation, filling the air with smoke. The risk of food contamination was high, as we discussed, leading to a vicious cycle. Malnutrition weakens your immune system, making you more susceptible to foodborne illnesses, which in turn deplete your already scarce nutrients and worsen your overall health. It's a downward spiral that is incredibly difficult to escape once it begins. You would learn to ignore the flies, the occasional rodent, the dubious provenance of your ingredients, because hunger dulls your judgment and heightens your desperation. So, as you reflect on this segment, remember that for the vast majority of Romans, life was not a grand imperial adventure or a philosophical debate. It was a daily, visceral negotiation with the spectre of hunger. It was about the persistent emptiness in your gut, the weakening of your body, the dimming of your mind, and the constant, crushing anxiety of where the next meal would come from. Your ability to walk into a grocery store and choose from an abundance of safe, nutritious food, to know that you will always have enough to eat, is not merely a convenience. It is a profound liberation, a freedom from a misery that dominated the lives of countless Romans, a freedom they could only dream of, and a freedom that allows you to pursue aspirations far beyond mere survival. Now, having felt the constant gnaw of hunger and smelled the pervasive filth, let's turn our attention to the ever-present threat of physical violence and the crushing weight of an often arbitrary justice system that defined daily life for many Romans. Step out from the relative and I use that term very loosely, safety of your cramped apartment into the cacophony of the Roman street, especially after dusk. In your modern world, you rely on streetlights, police patrols, and a relatively predictable legal framework to ensure your safety. In ancient Rome, you were largely on your own, navigating a landscape where might often made right, and where the law, if it applied to you at all, was a blunt, often inaccessible, and terrifying instrument. As night falls, the narrow streets, already choked with the detritus of the day, transform. The bustling energy of the market, the cries of vendors, the endless chatter, slowly gives way to a different kind of din, the shouts of revelers, the mournful cries of abandoned children, and the chilling, anonymous sounds that suggest something far more sinister. There are no streetlights as you know them. Occasional lamps might flicker outside the homes of the wealthy, or from a tavern, casting grotesque, shifting shadows that play tricks on your eyes, making every corner, every alleyway a potential ambush point. You clutch your meager purse, if you have one, a knot of fear tightening in your stomach. Every shadow becomes a potential threat, every sudden noise a reason to quicken your pace. Street crime was endemic. Robbery, assault, and even murder were not uncommon occurrences, especially for those venturing out after dark, or for anyone perceived as vulnerable. You might be a lone traveler returning home, a servant running an errand, or simply someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Gangs of thugs, often unemployed or disaffected young men, roamed the labyrinthine streets, their intentions rarely benign. You might hear stories of citizens being beaten, their possessions stolen, left bleeding in a gutter, and you know with a chilling certainty that this could easily be your fate. There was no 911 to call, no rapid response police force. If you were attacked, your only hope was your own strength, the unlikely intervention of a passerby, or the sheer luck of surviving long enough to escape. And this wasn't just about street crime. The Roman concept of law and order was fundamentally different from your own. While there were laws, they were often applied unequally, and justice was frequently slow, corruptible, and brutal. If you were a man of means, a citizen of high status, you might have access to lawyers, to powerful patrons who could influence the outcome of a case. But if you were a poor plebeian, a freedman, or worst of all, a slave, your legal rights were severely curtailed, often non-existent. You were largely at the mercy of the powerful, of local officials, of the very rich who could bend the law to their will with impunity. Imagine being accused of a crime you didn't commit, perhaps by a powerful neighbor who wants your small property, or a street vendor who mistakes you for someone else. There's no presumption of innocence for you, no robust defense team. You might be dragged before a magistrate, facing accusations without any real means to defend yourself. Confessions could be extracted through torture, especially if you were a slave or someone of low status. The burden of proof often fell heavily on the accused, and the scales of justice were almost always tilted against the poor and the powerless. The fear of false accusation, of being swept up in a bureaucratic nightmare that could lead to imprisonment, flogging, or even crucifixion would be a constant, chilling undercurrent in your life. And let's not forget the sheer, casual brutality that permeated Roman society, often sanctioned by the state itself. The gladiatorial games, for instance, were not just entertainment. They were public spectacles of extreme violence designed to both pacify and desensitize the masses. You would sit in the amphitheater, perhaps on a hard stone bench among thousands of others, the roar of the crowd assaulting your ears. Before you, men would fight to the death, often under the duress of slavery, their bodies glistening with sweat and blood, their screams echoing in the vast arena. Animals would be slaughtered, often in gruesome displays of exotic power, or used to execute criminals in horrifying ways. You would witness these spectacles with a mixture of morbid fascination, fear, and perhaps a growing numbness. This wasn't some distant, abstract violence on a screen. It was real, visceral, and happening right before your eyes. You'd smell the blood, hear the groans, see the life drain from a man's eyes. Your modern conscience would recoil, but in Rome, this was normalized, expected, celebrated. Even beyond the arena, physical punishment was a common and brutal reality. Flogging was a routine punishment for various offenses carried out publicly, designed not just to punish, but to humiliate and terrorize. Imagine witnessing a man being tied to a post, his back bared, the whip whistling through the air, tearing flesh with each crack. The cries, the blood, the sheer spectacle of human suffering would be seared into your memory. You would quickly learn the consequences of stepping out of line, of attracting unwanted attention, of challenging authority. The fear of such physical torment would be a powerful deterrent, shaping your behavior, forcing you into a meek subservience, a constant suppression of your own desires and frustrations. For slaves, the threat of violence was even more immediate and pervasive. As we'll discuss, they were property, subject to the absolute whim of their masters. A slave could be beaten, branded, tortured, or even killed for the slightest infraction, or for no reason at all, with little to no legal recourse. You would see this abuse, you would hear the screams, you would witness the broken bodies, and a chilling realization would dawn on you. If a powerful Roman could do this to his property, what stopped him from doing something similar to you, a mere plebeian, if you displeased him? The line between slave and free in terms of vulnerability to arbitrary violence was often thinner than you might imagine. Even within families, violence could be a fact of life. The paterfamilias, the male head of the household, held immense power over his wife, children, and slaves, including the right to inflict corporal punishment, and in ancient times, even to kill them, though this power waned in later periods. While not exercised casually, the psychological shadow of this absolute authority would hang heavy over every household, fostering an atmosphere of fear and unquestioning obedience. You would learn to navigate these complex power dynamics, to appease, to defer, to avoid provoking the wrath of those with authority over you, whether in your family, your workplace, or the broader society. And then there was the ever-present threat of military conscription. While often reserved for citizens, the call to arms could tear you away from your family, your livelihood, and plunge you into the brutal reality of warfare. You would be trained to kill, to endure hardship, to march for endless miles, to face the enemy in bloody hand-to-hand combat. The risk of death or severe injury was astronomical. You might lose a limb, suffer a debilitating wound, or simply perish on a distant battlefield, your body left unburied, your family never knowing your fate. The glory of military conquest, so celebrated by the elite, was for you, the common soldier, a terrifying gamble with your life, your body, and your future. So, as you disentangle yourself from the terrifying embrace of Roman streets and its justice system, consider the unseen safeguards that protect you in your modern life. The ubiquitous presence of police, the detailed legal codes, the presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, the availability of emergency services, and the societal abhorrence of public brutality. These are not merely conveniences. They are fundamental protections against violence and arbitrary power, allowing you to walk through your world with a sense of security and dignity that was largely absent for the vast majority of people living in ancient Rome. Their world was one where fear was a constant companion, where brutality was normalized, and where your very physical safety was a fragile, precarious thing constantly at risk from the whims of others, the chaos of the streets, and the often indifferent hand of the law. Now, let's delve into perhaps the most fundamental and pervasive misery of ancient Rome, a misery so deeply ingrained in the fabric of society that it touched every aspect of life, even for those who were technically free: the omnipresence of slavery and the suffocating weight of oppression. Forget the sanitized, often romanticized versions you might have encountered in fiction. The reality of Roman slavery was a brutal, soul-crushing existence, a stark reminder of the absolute power one human being could wield over another. a power far greater and more terrifying than any you can possibly comprehend from your modern vantage point. Imagine waking up, not in your own bed, in your own home, with the agency to choose how you will spend your day, but in a crowded, dimly lit slave quarters. You don't own your clothes, you don't own your body, you don't own your time, and you certainly don't own your future. You are property, an object, an extension of your master's will, no different in legal status than a farm animal or a piece of furniture. This isn't just a job you dislike. It's a complete annihilation of your personhood, a brutal stripping away of every right and dignity you hold dear. Your day begins before dawn, often with a harsh summons from an overseer or a senior slave. There's no negotiation, no sick days, no complaints about working conditions. Your existence is defined by labor, relentless and often physically punishing. If you're a rural slave, you're likely working on a vast latifundium, a large estate, toiling in the fields from sunup to sundown. Imagine the crushing heat of the Italian summer, the biting cold of winter, your body aching, your hands calloused and bleeding from working with crude tools. You're harvesting grain, tending vineyards, shearing sheep, digging ditches, your movements dictated by the rhythm of the whip or the ever-present threat of it. The work is monotonous, backbreaking, and performed under constant supervision, with little food or rest. You are just a cog in a vast agricultural machine, your worth measured only by your productivity. If you're an urban slave, your life might be different, but no less miserable. You could be a domestic servant in a wealthy household, constantly on call, cleaning, cooking, carrying water, tending to your master's every whim. The physical labor might be less intense, but the psychological toll is immense. You're under constant scrutiny, your privacy non-existent, your every mistake potentially met with severe punishment. You live in a state of perpetual anxiety, trying to anticipate your master's mood, to avoid his displeasure, to navigate the complex, often cruel hierarchy of the household slaves. You hear whispers of other slaves being beaten, branded or sent to the mines for minor infractions, and that fear becomes a cold, hard knot in your stomach. Or perhaps you're a slave in a workshop, a bakery, a construction site, or a mine. The mines were often a death sentence, a horrifying abyss of perpetual darkness, toxic air, cave-ins and brutal overseers where slaves were worked until they literally dropped dead from exhaustion or injury. Imagine being chained to your work, the damp, cold air seeping into your bones, the rhythmic clang of pickaxes echoing around you, knowing that you will likely never see the light of day again, that your life will end in this subterranean hellhole, your body discarded like refuse. The sheer hopelessness of such an existence would break even the strongest spirit. The casual brutality of Roman slavery is what would truly shock your modern conscience. Masters had the legal right to inflict virtually any punishment upon their slaves, short of summary execution in later periods, though even that was often overlooked. A master could beat you, flog you, brand you, sexually assault you, or even crucify you for a perceived transgression. And there was no recourse, no authority you could appeal to. The law saw you as property, and property could be managed, used, and abused as its owner saw fit. Imagine living with that constant, immediate threat hanging over your head, knowing that a moment of anger from your master, a misunderstanding or simply a bad day for him, could result in agonizing pain, disfigurement, or even death. Even benevolent masters, who might treat their slaves relatively well, still fundamentally denied their humanity. The concept of your own agency, your right to make choices about your life, your body, your family, was non-existent. You couldn't choose whom to marry, or even to marry at all without your master's permission. Your children, if you had them, were also born into slavery, continuing the cycle of oppression. The anguish of watching your children be sold away to another master, knowing you might never see them again, powerless to intervene, would be a sorrow so profound it would shatter your soul. Your family ties, the most basic human bonds, were fragile, easily severed by the whim of an owner. The very air of Rome was saturated with the labor of slaves. They built the roads, the aqueducts, the temples, the amphitheaters. They tilled the fields that fed the city. They managed the households, educated the children, ran the businesses. This omnipresence meant that even for free citizens, the lines could blur, and the fear of falling into slavery was a constant, terrifying possibility. Debt could lead to enslavement, though this practice gradually diminished for Roman citizens. Capture in war was a direct route to the slave market. You lived with the knowledge that a turn of fortune, a bad debt, a military defeat could strip you of your freedom and plunge you into this abyss. And the psychological impact of being a slave? It's almost unimaginable. The constant dehumanization, the forced obedience, the suppression of your own will, the erosion of your self-worth. You would learn to hide your true feelings, to mask your resentment, to present a docile, obedient facade to survive. But underneath, a deep current of anger, sorrow, and despair would fester. Some slaves rebelled, a few famously, like Spartacus, but most lived out their lives in quiet desperation, dreaming of freedom, perhaps of manumission, the act of being freed by their master, which was a possibility, but by no means a certainty, and often came only after a lifetime of service. Even freedmen, while technically free, often retained obligations to their former masters and faced social stigma, still living in the shadow of their past bondage. Consider the absence of hope. In your world, even in difficult circumstances, there's often a path to improvement, a chance to change your circumstances through education, hard work, or a lucky break. For a slave in Rome, such paths were largely non-existent. Your life was predetermined, your destiny fixed by the accident of your birth, or the brutality of conquest, or the misfortune of debt. The feeling of being trapped, of having no future beyond the relentless toil and constant fear, would be a daily, crushing weight on your spirit. You'd see the free citizens enjoying their rights, their leisure, their ability to make choices, and the bitterness would be a sharp, painful ache in your heart. The fear of slave rebellion was also a pervasive force, even for masters, leading to even greater paranoia and brutality. The crucifixion of Spartacus's followers, lining the Appian Way for miles, was a stark, horrifying reminder of the consequences of resistance. This wasn't just ancient history. It was a visible, lingering threat that shaped policy and fueled public terror. You would be constantly aware of the tensions simmering beneath the surface, the potential for a sudden, violent uprising, and the equally violent suppression that would follow. So, as you step back from this profound darkness, reflect on the foundational freedom you possess today. The right to your own body, your own labor, your own choices. The fundamental belief in your inherent human dignity. The legal protections that prevent you from being bought and sold, from being arbitrarily abused, from having your family torn apart. These are not mere privileges. They are the bedrock of your modern existence, a liberation from a form of misery that defined the lives of millions in ancient Rome, a misery that stripped them of everything that makes life worth living. Their world was built on the suffering of others, a constant, silent scream beneath the marble veneer of empire. Now let's turn our gaze from the individual miseries of everyday life to the broader, often terrifying, forces that shaped the Roman world, the relentless churn of political instability and the constant, devastating spectre of warfare. In your tranquil modern society, you likely take for granted the stable transfer of power, the relatively peaceful political discourse, and the general absence of direct, existential threats of war on your doorstep. For a Roman, particularly during certain tumultuous periods, these were unimaginable luxuries. Your life was constantly buffeted by the whims of powerful men, the machinations of ambitious politicians, and the brutal reality of an empire built and maintained through an almost perpetual state of conflict. Imagine living in a city where the head of state, The emperor himself could be assassinated at any moment, where ambitious generals could march their legions on the capital, plunging the empire into bloody civil war at the drop of a hat. This wasn't a rare anomaly. It was a recurring nightmare, especially during the tumultuous transitions between emperors or during periods of military unrest. You'd wake up one morning to rumors whispering through the forum, hushed tones discussing a new coup, a new claimant to the throne, a new general declaring himself the rightful ruler. Your sense of security, already fragile, would shatter. When civil war erupted, and it did so with terrifying frequency, especially during the late Republic and various crises of the empire, the consequences for you, the common citizen, were devastating. Armies, numbering in the tens of thousands, would march across the Italian peninsula, through your very provinces. These were not precision military operations designed to minimize civilian casualties. These were forces that needed to be fed, supplied, and often paid.
And who bore the brunt of that burden? You did.
Your farms could be plundered, your crops seized, your livestock slaughtered or confiscated to feed the legions. Your family's meager savings could be extorted by commanders demanding contributions to their cause. You might see your home burned, your fields trampled, your livelihood utterly destroyed, not by an invading enemy, but by the very Roman soldiers supposedly protecting you. Conscription into these armies was another brutal reality. While often voluntary for citizens seeking advancement or spoils, during times of desperate need or civil war, you could be forcibly conscripted. Imagine being torn away from your family, your wife and children, your elderly parents, with little warning. You're handed a spear and a shield, given rudimentary training, and then marched off to fight and potentially die in a conflict whose origins and objectives might be completely incomprehensible to you. You would be a pawn in a larger game of power, your individual life rendered utterly expendable. You would leave your home knowing you might never return, or if you did, you might be a broken man, maimed, traumatized, unable to resume your former life. The psychological toll of this constant instability would be immense. You couldn't trust the leaders. Their allegiances shifted like sand. You couldn't trust the system. It could collapse into chaos at any moment. The future was an opaque, terrifying unknown. You would live with a persistent, low-grade anxiety, always listening for rumors, always trying to discern the political winds, always prepared for the worst. This instability didn't just affect grand political figures. It trickled down, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that permeated every layer of society. Merchants couldn't plan for the future. Farmers couldn't invest in their land. Families couldn't feel secure in their homes. And then there was the external threat. Rome was an empire built on conquest, and conquest inevitably breeds enemies. The borders were vast and constantly under pressure from various barbarian tribes: Germans, Gauls, Parthians, Dacians, and many others. You would hear news of skirmishes, of raids, of full-scale invasions on the distant frontiers. While these might seem far removed, they had direct consequences for you. They meant heavy taxes to fund the legions, conscription to swell their ranks, and a constant drain on the empire's resources. You might live in a border province and witness the horrors of invasion firsthand, your town sacked, your people enslaved, your way of life utterly destroyed. Even if you lived safely within the heart of the empire, the fear of invasion, though more abstract, was still present. Propaganda constantly reminded you of the need for eternal vigilance, of the dangers lurking beyond the civilized world. You would see the returning legions, their ranks thinned, their veterans scarred and hardened, a visible testament to the brutal cost of maintaining the Pax Romana. This Roman peace was not a peace born of tranquility, but a peace enforced by overwhelming military might, a fragile calm constantly threatened by external pressures and internal strife. The economic consequences of constant warfare and political upheaval were also devastating. Trade routes could be disrupted by civil war or foreign incursions, leading to shortages and price spikes. The value of coinage could fluctuate wildly as emperors debased the currency to pay their troops or shore up their finances, eroding your meager savings and making it harder to conduct business. Inflation could wipe out your ability to afford basic necessities. Imagine working hard to save a few denarii, only to find their purchasing power halved overnight due to a new emperor's desperate fiscal policies. Your efforts, your sacrifices, could be rendered meaningless by forces entirely beyond your control. Public works projects, essential for the city's infrastructure, might be abandoned or neglected during times of crisis. Roads could fall into disrepair. Aqueducts might not be maintained. Public buildings could crumble. This decay, slow but relentless, further eroded the quality of your life, making travel more difficult, access to clean water less reliable, and the overall urban environment more squalid. The resources that could have been used to improve the lives of ordinary citizens were instead constantly diverted to the ravenous maw of military expenditure and political maneuvering. The very atmosphere of the city during these periods of crisis would be one of heightened tension and paranoia. People would be afraid to speak their minds, afraid to express dissent, knowing that informers were everywhere and that a careless word could lead to arrest, torture, or execution by whatever faction was currently in power. You would learn to keep your head down, to outwardly conform, to avoid politics entirely, because engaging in it was a dangerous, often deadly game. Your opinions, your concerns, your grievances mattered little in the face of absolute power backed by legions. Consider the sheer weight of knowing that your life, your family's safety, your very existence, was contingent on the fickle fortunes of distant battles and the ruthless ambitions of powerful individuals. You had no vote in imperial succession, no say in declarations of war, no voice in the decisions that shaped your destiny. You were a subject, not a truly empowered citizen in the modern sense. Your personal hopes and dreams were constantly overshadowed by the looming threat of grand, impersonal forces that could sweep you away at any moment. So, as you emerge from this contemplation of Roman political chaos and constant war, reflect on the profound privilege of your own stable political environment. The peaceful transitions of power, the established legal frameworks, the freedom to express your opinions without fear of reprisal, and the absence of armies marching through your streets. These are not trivial details. They are fundamental components of a life free from the profound and pervasive misery that political instability and constant warfare inflicted upon countless Romans, whose lives were perpetually on the brink of being shattered by the ambitious, brutal forces of their age. Now let's bring the focus down, away from the grand sweep of empire and war, and plunge into the minute. Suffocating details of your everyday living conditions as a common Roman. Forget your spacious, climate-controlled apartment or house with its private rooms, running water, and reliable electricity. For the vast majority of Rome's teeming population, home was a place of endless noise, cramped quarters, constant threat, and profound lack of privacy, a crucible of daily misery that would utterly break your modern spirit. Imagine, first, your home. It's likely not a house at all, but a single room, or perhaps two, within a towering,
multi-story apartment block known as an insula.
These insulae were the skyscrapers of the ancient world, often rising 5, 6, or even 7 stories high, packed shoulder to shoulder in the city's densest areas. They were poorly constructed, often from cheap brick, timber, and rubble, and hastily built to meet the overwhelming demand for housing in a rapidly growing metropolis. You enter the building not through a grand foyer, but through a narrow, dark passageway, already assaulted by the smells and sounds of dozens of other families living in close proximity. Your room itself is tiny. Forget separate bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, a bathroom. You likely live, eat, and sleep in the same cramped space with your entire family, your spouse, your children, perhaps even an elderly parent or a distant relative. There are no individual beds as you know them. Perhaps a communal sleeping mat on the floor. or a crude wooden platform built against a wall.
Every inch of space is precious, every possession carefully tucked away to maximize what little room you have.
There's no personal space, no quiet corner to retreat to, no solitude whatsoever. Your entire existence is lived in full view and full earshot of your family members and indeed your neighbors. Privacy is a concept utterly alien to your life in the insular E. The walls between apartments are thin, often porous. You can hear everything, your neighbors' arguments, their children crying, their late-night activities, the sounds of their cooking, their conversations. Your own life, similarly, is an open book to them. The air itself seems to vibrate with the collective hum of hundreds of lives lived in agonizing proximity. This constant auditory intrusion would be maddening for your modern brain, accustomed to isolating sounds and retreating into your own sonic bubble. Here, there is no escape. The sheer volume of human noise is relentless, a constant low-level stressor. Now, let's talk about the specific dangers within these living spaces. Fire. This was the terrifying,
Omnipresent threat that hung over every insular dweller.
These buildings, constructed from wood and cheap materials, were incredibly flammable. Open cooking fires, charcoal braziers for heat, oil lamps for light, all of these were constant fire hazards. Imagine falling asleep, exhausted from a day of labor, only to be jolted awake by the screams of fire from below or above. The narrow staircases, the lack of emergency exits, the sheer density of population, and the speed with which fire could spread through such structures meant that escape was often impossible. You would wake to the acrid smell of smoke, the crackling of flames, the rising heat, and the horrifying realization that your only way out might already be engulfed. Entire blocks of insulae could be consumed in a single night, leaving thousands homeless, injured, or dead. This wasn't some abstract possibility. It was a recurring tragedy, a constant fear that shaped your life. Then there's the issue of sanitation, revisited within your living space. As we discussed, there's no running water in your apartment, no private toilet. You fetch water from a public fountain, carrying heavy amphorae up multiple flights of stairs, a daily chore that saps your already limited energy. For human waste, you rely on a chamber pot. Imagine the smell contained within your small, airless room, especially on a hot summer night. And then the disposal, often out the window onto the street below, contributing to the very filth we discussed. There are no trash cans, no refuse collection services that reach your upper floor. So, waste accumulates, attracting vermin. Rats, mice, and insects are your constant companions. They scurry through the walls, infest your meager food stores, crawl over your sleeping bodies. You live in a constant battle against these unwelcome guests, a battle you rarely win. Their presence isn't just an annoyance, it's a source of disease, another vector for the pathogens that constantly threaten your health. You might hear the scratching of tiny claws in the night, the rustling in your pantry, and a shiver of disgust and fear would run down your spine. The sheer lack of light and fresh air is another misery. Your small room might have a tiny window, often without glass, covered only by a wooden shutter if anything. This means little natural light, forcing you to rely on expensive smoke-producing oil lamps for illumination, or to simply live in perpetual dimness. And the air, even if it could circulate, would be filled with the odors of your family, your neighbors, the street outside, and the smoke from cooking fires. Ventilation is poor, making the summers stifling hot and the winters damp and cold. You would breathe stale, heavy air, contributing to respiratory problems and general discomfort. Sleeping itself would be a challenge. The hardness of the floor or crude sleeping platform, the constant noise from within your building and the street outside, the oppressive heat or chill, the fear of fire, the presence of vermin, all conspire to make restful sleep a luxury rarely afforded. You would wake up still tired, your body aching, your mind dulled by fragmented sleep, only to face another day of labor and misery. The restorative power of deep, uninterrupted sleep, which you cherish, would be almost completely absent from your Roman life. The cost of living in such miserable conditions was also often exorbitant. Landlords, often wealthy senators or equestrians, would charge high rents, knowing the desperate demand for housing in Rome. You might spend a significant portion of your meager income just to secure this cramped, dangerous, unsanitary space, and these landlords were often absentee owners, caring little for the condition of their properties, simply maximizing their profits. Repairs were rare, upkeep minimal, and the buildings slowly deteriorated, becoming even more dangerous and unpleasant over time. You might complain, but your voice would carry no weight. You were disposable, easily replaceable if you couldn't pay. Even the simple act of walking outside your building presented its own set of miseries. The narrow, crowded streets were not designed for pedestrian comfort. They were choked with carts, animals, and thousands of other desperate souls. There were no sidewalks, as you know them. Pedestrians jostled for space with wheeled traffic, creating a constant sense of danger. You would be jostled, pushed, shouted at. Your journey through the city, a constant battle against the crowd, the noise, and the hazards of the street. Your daily commute, if you can even call it that, would be an exhausting, stressful ordeal before your workday even began. So, as you draw a deep breath in your quiet, secure, and private space, consider the profound blessings of modern housing. Your separate rooms, your comfortable bed, your private bathroom, the running water, the electricity, the controlled climate, the relative peace and quiet. These are not just amenities. They are fundamental elements of human dignity, physical health, and mental well-being that were almost entirely absent for the majority of people living in ancient Rome. Their homes, far from being havens, were often sources of profound misery, places of danger, discomfort, and relentless assault on their senses and their spirits. Now, let's turn our attention to the deepest, most personal form of misery, the agony of the body itself, and the brutal reality of primitive medicine in ancient Rome. In your world, a sudden, sharp pain, a persistent cough, or a fever sends you to a doctor where you expect accurate diagnosis, effective treatment, and relief from suffering. In ancient Rome, you lived in a constant, low-level dread of illness and injury, knowing that when pain struck, it would likely be profound, prolonged, and largely unalleviated, often leading to a slow,
Agonizing death. Imagine waking up with a searing toothache.
in your time, a quick trip to the dentist, a numbing shot, and a filling would solve the problem. In Rome, your options are horrifyingly limited. There are no dentists as you know them, no anesthesia, no sterile tools. You might try home remedies, herbal poultices, or visit a tooth puller, often a barber or a blacksmith, who, with crude pliers and brute force, would wrench the offending tooth from your jaw. Imagine the excruciating, unmitigated pain, the blood, the bone fragments, the lingering agony, and the almost certain risk of infection in the gaping wound left behind. This wasn't a minor discomfort. It was a profound trauma, a memory etched in pure, raw pain. Many would simply endure the toothache until the tooth decayed completely, or the infection spread, leading to facial swelling, fever, and often a painful death. Consider a simple broken bone. In your world, you get an X-ray, a cast, pain medication, and a relatively swift recovery. In Rome, a broken limb could be a life-altering disaster. There might be a bone setter, but their knowledge of anatomy was rudimentary, their methods often violent and inexact. They might try to set the bone, but without proper immobilization, without understanding infection, without modern pain relief, the recovery would be agonizingly slow if it happened at all. The bone might heal crooked, leaving you with a permanent deformity, a limp or a crippled limb that prevents you from performing manual labor, thus sealing your fate into deeper poverty. The pain, a constant throbbing companion, would become your new normal. Even common illnesses, which you shrug off with over-the-counter medicine, were terrifying threats. A bad fever could quickly escalate, leaving you delirious, racked with chills and sweats. There were no antibiotics, no antivirals, no effective treatments for most infections. Doctors, often Greek freedmen or slaves, had some knowledge of herbal remedies, surgery, and basic anatomy, but their understanding of disease causation was fundamentally flawed. They believed in the imbalance of humors, in the influence of gods and spirits, not in germs. Their treatments were often ineffective and sometimes even harmful. You might be bled with leeches, given purges to induce vomiting or diarrhea, or prescribed strange concoctions that did little more than make you sicker. Imagine the sheer helplessness as you watch a loved one, a child, a spouse, waste away from a mysterious illness. You call upon the gods, make offerings, consult various healers, but nothing works. You witness their pain, their suffering, their slow decline, and you are utterly powerless. The grief would be compounded by the utter lack of understanding, the gnawing question of why, without any rational answer. The average lifespan was short, childhood mortality astronomically high, and death was a constant, intimate companion, often arriving through brutal, agonizing illnesses that medical science could do nothing to alleviate. Surgery, when performed, was a terrifying last resort. Picture a battlefield surgeon or a doctor in a well-equipped, for the time, infirmary, attempting to remove an arrow, amputate a limb, or set a compound fracture. There was no anesthesia, beyond perhaps a strong dose of wine or opium, which would only dull the edges of the agony. Imagine being held down by several strong men, screaming in unbearable pain as a saw cuts through your bone, as hot irons are applied to cauterize wounds. The shock, the blood loss, and the almost inevitable infection that followed would be more likely to kill you than the original injury. Survival of major surgery was rare, a testament not to the surgeon's skill, but to the patient's sheer, raw fortitude and luck. Even chronic conditions that you manage with medication today were a source of perpetual suffering. Arthritis, gout, chronic back pain, persistent headaches. These were daily burdens that had no effective treatment. You would simply have to endure the pain, to push through it, to continue your labor despite the constant agony that racked your body. Your body would become a landscape of aches and pains, a constant reminder of its vulnerability and the limits of ancient medicine. Your definition of wellness would be vastly different from your modern one, encompassing a baseline of discomfort and debility that you would find intolerable. Mental health was also largely misunderstood and often stigmatized. Those suffering from severe mental illness might be seen as possessed, cursed, or simply mad, often subjected to harsh treatment, confinement, or neglect. There was no concept of therapy, no medications to alleviate the debilitating effects of depression, anxiety, or psychosis. You would live in a society where such suffering was not understood, and therefore not treated with compassion or effective remedies, leaving individuals to endure their internal torment in isolation and fear. The lack of personal hygiene and public sanitation we discussed earlier contributed directly to this medical misery. Dirty water, contaminated food, crowded living conditions, the constant presence of human and animal waste all created a fertile breeding ground for epidemics. Plague, smallpox, malaria, typhoid. These diseases could sweep through the city, wiping out thousands in a matter of weeks, leaving behind a trail of grief, fear, and desolation. You would live with the constant threat of these invisible scourges, knowing that at any moment, a cough or a fever could escalate into a terrifying epidemic that might claim you and your entire family. So, as you take a deep breath, perhaps stretching a muscle that doesn't ache, consider the profound relief of modern medical care. The pain relievers that banish your headaches, the antibiotics that conquer infections, the anesthetics that make surgery painless, the sophisticated diagnoses, the hygienic hospitals, and the knowledge that most illnesses are treatable. These are not merely advances, they are fundamental liberations from a world where pain was an inescapable companion, where illness was a terrifying lottery, and where death often arrived slowly, agonizingly, and without relief. Your ancestors lived lives shaped by the constant, agonizing reality of their own fragile, suffering bodies, a misery you are blessed to largely avoid. Now let's turn our attention to the invisible chains that bound you in ancient Rome, even if you were technically free. The suffocating weight of social hierarchy, the crushing lack of rights for the vast majority, and the profound misery of having your destiny largely predetermined by the accident of your birth. In your modern world, you champion equality, individual rights, and upward mobility as fundamental ideals. In Rome, you were born into a rigidly stratified system, a caste of sorts, from which escape was incredibly difficult, and for many, utterly impossible, leading to a constant, soul-crushing sense of powerlessness. Imagine being born a woman. Immediately, half of your potential is gone. You are denied political rights. You cannot vote, cannot hold public office, cannot serve in the military, cannot participate in the public sphere in the same way men can. Your legal standing, while better than that of a slave, is still subordinate to men, first your father, pater familias, then your husband. You are largely confined to the domestic sphere, your worth often measured by your ability to bear children, particularly male heirs, and to manage the household. Your education, if you receive one at all, is often focused on domestic skills and perhaps some basic literacy, but rarely on intellectual pursuits that would allow you to challenge your prescribed role. The anxiety of a Roman woman would be immense. Your marriage is often arranged not for love, but for political or economic advantage. You might be married off to a man much older than yourself, a stranger, and your life would then be subject to his control. Divorce was possible, but often came with social stigma and economic uncertainty. The constant pressure to produce heirs and the emotional toll of frequent childbirth, often without effective medical care, would be a relentless burden. You would witness the high mortality rates for women in childbirth, the devastating loss
of infants, and a cold dread would settle in your heart, knowing that your body, your very existence, was constantly at risk.
Your dreams, your aspirations, if you dared to have any beyond your societal role, would be quietly, painfully suppressed. Now, imagine being born a plebeian, a common free citizen, not into the elite, senatorial, or equestrian orders. While you have certain rights that a slave or a foreigner does not, these rights are often abstract and difficult to enforce. You might be able to vote in certain assemblies, but your vote counts for far less than that of a wealthy Roman, whose influence, client networks, and political patronage effectively dominate the political landscape. Your voice is a whisper in a storm, easily drowned out by the roar of the powerful. Upward mobility, the idea that you can significantly improve your social and economic standing through hard work and talent, is largely a myth for you. You are born into a certain class, and there you largely stay. Your trade is often inherited from your father, your social circle dictated by your birth. While there are rare exceptions, individuals who rise through the ranks, they are exactly that, exceptions, celebrated precisely because they defy the crushing weight of the system. For the vast majority, your children will face the same limited opportunities, the same struggles, the same lack of power that you do. The hope for a better future, which fuels so much of your modern ambition, would be a distant, almost mocking illusion. Consider the sheer indignity of living in a world where your worth is constantly judged by your birth, your family name, your wealth, and your social connections, rather than by your character or your abilities. You would constantly feel the subtle and not so subtle slights from those above you, the way they look at you, the way they dismiss your concerns, the way they treat you as inferior. You would witness the casual arrogance of the elite, their entitlement, their disregard for your struggles, and a bitter resentment would fester within you, even if you dared not express it openly. If you are a freedman, a former slave who has gained freedom, your status is even more ambiguous and fraught with challenges. While no longer property, you still owe obligations to your former master, often remaining part of his client network, beholden to him for support and protection. You carry the stigma of your former bondage, and your children might still be looked down upon. Full integration into free society with all its rights and privileges is a long and arduous path, often never fully achieved in your lifetime. You are in a liminal space, neither fully slave nor fully free, constantly reminded of your past and your limitations. Even if you were a skilled artisan, a craftsman, you would still be subject to the whims of the wealthy patrons who commissioned your work. Your prices could be haggled down, your labor exploited, your payment delayed, all because you had less power, less influence, and less legal recourse than your client. You lived in a constant state of economic vulnerability, your livelihood dependent on the patronage of those above you in the social hierarchy, forcing you into a deferential, often humiliating relationship. For the vast numbers of non-citizens, including foreign residents, merchants, and conquered peoples, their rights were even more restricted. They often paid higher taxes, had fewer legal protections, and were subject to the prejudices of the Roman populace. They might be tolerated for their skills or their economic contributions, but they were never truly integrated, always seen as outsiders, their lives often more precarious than even the poorest Roman citizen. Imagine living in a society where you are a second-class citizen, subject to different laws, different expectations, and constant discrimination. The psychological toll of this rigid hierarchy is immense. You are constantly aware of your place, of the limits placed upon you. You cannot dream freely, cannot aspire without bumping up against an impenetrable wall of social status. Your sense of self-worth is constantly eroded by a system that tells you day after day that you are less, that you are unimportant, that your life matters less than those born into privilege. This isn't just about economic hardship. It's about a profound spiritual and emotional misery, a crushing sense of being trapped, of having no real agency over your own fate. You would learn to suppress your ambitions, to accept your lot, to find small comforts within the confines of your class. But underneath, a quiet desperation would linger, a longing for a world where your abilities, your character, your very humanity were valued above the accident of your birth. The injustice of it, the sheer unfairness, would be a bitter pill you swallowed daily. So, as you reflect on this segment, pause and consider the revolutionary concept of equality that underpins your modern world. The idea that all individuals, regardless of gender, race, or birth, possess inherent rights and dignity. The belief that with hard work and talent, you can climb the social ladder, that your future is largely determined by your own choices, not by your lineage. These are not just abstract ideals. They are fundamental freedoms, liberations from a profound and pervasive misery that shackled the minds, bodies, and spirits of countless Romans whose lives were defined by the invisible, yet unbreakable chains of their birth. Finally, let's explore the last, and perhaps most subtle, yet deeply pervasive misery of ancient Rome, the crushing weight of superstition, the constant existential dread of unseen forces, and the profound lack of scientific understanding that left the Roman soul vulnerable to fear, uncertainty, and a pervasive sense of powerlessness in the face of an unpredictable cosmos. In your modern age, you live in a world illuminated by scientific discovery, where phenomena have rational explanations, and where much of the unknown has been categorized and understood. For a Roman, the world was a far more mysterious, menacing, and often terrifying place. Imagine living in a world where every unusual event, every unexpected misfortune, every natural disaster could be interpreted as a direct message, a warning, or a punishment from capricious gods. A sudden thunderstorm might not just be weather, it could be Jupiter expressing his wrath. A bird flying in an unusual pattern might not just be a bird, it could be an omen portending good fortune or imminent disaster. The Romans were deeply superstitious, their lives governed by an intricate web of rituals, omens and auguries, all designed to placate the gods and decipher their will. This wasn't just a quaint cultural practice, it was a source of profound anxiety. You would constantly be on edge, interpreting every flicker of a lamp, every stray animal, every unusual dream. Did you spill salt?
A bad omen.
Did you trip when leaving your house? Pause, return, and restart your day, for ill luck might follow. The pressure to perform the correct rituals, to offer the right sacrifices, to observe the innumerable sacred days and festivals was immense. Failure to do so could invite divine displeasure, leading to personal misfortune, illness, or even public calamity. Imagine the mental burden of constantly trying to navigate this complex, often contradictory religious landscape, always fearful of an unseen transgression. The lack of scientific understanding meant that there were no rational explanations for many of the miseries that plagued Roman life. Why did the crops fail? Why did the plague sweep through the city? Why did a loved one fall ill and die? Without knowledge of meteorology, germ theory, or epidemiology, the only answer available was divine will, magic, or malevolent spirits. This left you, the common Roman, in a state of profound helplessness. You couldn't fight disease with medicine. You couldn't prevent famine with advanced agricultural techniques. You couldn't understand the forces that shaped your life. All you could do was pray, sacrifice, and hope that the gods, for some inscrutable reason, would show you favor. This existential dread wasn't just about big events. It permeated the small moments of your life too. The fear of malevolent spirits, of the restless dead, of curses and evil eyes. You might wear amulets, engage in protective rituals, or seek out local sorcerers for counterspells, all driven by a deep-seated fear of unseen forces that could inflict harm upon you and your family. Your world was not just populated by other humans, it was teeming with invisible entities, some benevolent, many malevolent, all demanding respect and propitiation. You would always feel a sense of unease, a constant awareness that you were never truly alone, never truly safe from the supernatural. Death itself, as we discussed with medicine, was a frequent and brutal visitor. But beyond the physical pain, there was the spiritual uncertainty. What happened after death? Was there an afterlife? Was it a grim, shadowy existence in the underworld, as tradition held? Or was it something else, something terrifying and unknown? Philosophies like Stoicism offered some solace, teaching acceptance of fate, but for the vast majority, the afterlife remained a realm of mystery and apprehension. The grief for lost loved ones was compounded by the uncertainty of their fate and the fear of your own ultimate journey into the unknown. Even for the educated elite, who might embrace Greek philosophical rationalism, superstition still held sway in various forms. Astrologers were consulted, omens were still heeded, and public rituals were meticulously performed, even if the personal belief was more nuanced. The collective psyche of Rome was deeply steeped in these beliefs, and escaping their influence entirely was almost impossible, even for the most skeptical individual. You would be constantly surrounded by a culture permeated by these anxieties,
Absorbing them consciously or unconsciously.
into your own worldview. The weight of fate, the concept that your life was predetermined by the gods, or by some cosmic force, also contributed to this misery. While offering a kind of fatalistic acceptance, it also stripped away personal agency. If your successes and failures were preordained, what was the point of striving, of aspiring, of challenging your circumstances? This belief, common in various forms throughout antiquity, could lead to a sense of resignation, a passive acceptance of your lot, even if that lot was one of profound suffering. The modern belief in self-determination, in shaping your own destiny, would be largely absent, replaced by a sense of being a pawn in a larger, incomprehensible cosmic game. This wasn't just about believing in gods. It was about living in a constant state of uncertainty, fear, and powerlessness in the face of an unpredictable world. It was about the psychological burden of trying to interpret every sign, to appease every deity, to avoid every potential transgression, all while enduring the physical miseries of poverty, disease, and violence. The mental exhaustion of such a life, the sheer spiritual weight of it, would be profound. You would yearn for clarity, for understanding, for a sense of control over your own destiny. But these would remain elusive, so as you lean back, perhaps glancing at the scientific instruments or books in your own home, consider the profound liberation of living in a world of reason and scientific understanding. The ability to explain phenomena, to predict natural events, to treat diseases with evidence-based medicine, and to believe that your choices, your actions, can genuinely shape your future. These are not merely intellectual comforts. They are fundamental reliefs from a profound spiritual and existential misery that constantly weighed upon the Roman soul. Their world was one shrouded in fear, superstition, and a pervasive sense of cosmic powerlessness, a misery that your modern mind, thankfully, can barely fathom.